Hello and welcome to the March or Die show today. Very glad to have you joining me. This is the show where I do my very best every single episode to give you both the perspectives and the principles you need to march when it would be easier to stay where you are and die. We know that life has its ups and it has its downs. The question is, how do you keep moving forward when you're in one of those down moments? And that's what this show is about. But as we get started in the new year, I wanted to take a couple of episodes and really just talk, giving you some thoughts and some principles as you get into a new year, some strategies, I guess, if you will, on how you can find success in the new year. We come out of one year and whatever happened there happened. We get into a new year, and if we're honest, not much has changed, right? We're the same people. The date on the calendar may have changed, but our circumstances generally are pretty much the same. But there's something about a new year. There's something about the beginning of a year that allows us to hit the reset button and really plan for success in ways that maybe we didn't experience in the previous year. So I want to give you some thoughts on that. This episode and next episode will be me just talking to you. And then we will have some guests, and I'm, again, really excited about what this year will hold for the show. One of my favorite passages, I've shared this before on the podcast, one of my favorite passages is in the book of Hebrews, chapter number 12, verses 1 through 3. Hebrews chapter 12, 1 through 3. I've talked about these verses a number of times. I've preached on them in church settings. I've talked about them in teaching settings. I've shared them here on the podcast. But there are four principles, four perspectives that are found in those verses that I think we really need to get a hold of if we're going to move forward in a good way in a new year. These four principles that we're going to talk about, these ideas or perspectives, they're helpful at any time of the year, not just at the beginning of the year, but certainly in the beginning of the year, as we get started in a year. These are four things we need to get a hold of if we're going to move forward in a good way, if we're going to march when it would be easier, certainly at times, to stay where we are and die. And we find all of these right in this passage, verses 1 through 3 of Hebrews chapter 12. And they all start with the letter C, so they're easy to remember. I'll make it easy for you to remember. It also makes it easy for me to remember. So I want to share these with you today. And again, I hope they'll be a help to you. This is a shorter episode, but just some things that you can hang on to. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. I'm going to do my best to quote it. Sometimes I mess up, but I'm going to do my best. Hebrews chapter 12, verse number 1 says, "Wherefore," okay, thinking about what happened before. "Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about or surrounded about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us." Verse number 2, "Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him despised the shame and endured the cross." And the next verse number 3, goes on to help us to understand, "Lest you be wearied and faint in your mind." So when you're tired, when you're worn out, look to Jesus, pursue Jesus, understand the example that Jesus has set. But we find four things in these verses that are very helpful. And the first one is this, again, letter C, right? We first think about the crowd. The crowd. "Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses." This is where the author starts. He doesn't start by telling the listener what to do. He starts by setting the stage. Now that "wherefore" is important. It goes back to chapter 11 of Hebrews. This is the previous chapter. And chapter 11 is a listing, really, of men and women of faith. We hear about people like Abraham, who lived by faith. He's the father of faith. We hear about Noah, who built an ark for 120 years, built a boat before it had ever rained. And we know the story on the other side of that. God preserved him and his family because of his faith. We hear stories of the children of Israel crossing the Red Sea by faith and marching around those walls of Jericho before they fell by faith, and men like David who defeated a giant by faith. These acts of courage and these acts of faith. As you work through Hebrews chapter 11, though, you also have toward the end a phrase that goes something like this, "And then there were others." There were others. It lists then some unnamed people who were sawn asunder. They were killed for their faith. People who had to wander around in the wilderness because they had no home. People who were oppressed and persecuted. And yet, as Hebrews chapter 11 finishes, it says they did all of this by faith. They saw what God was going to do by faith. So when we get into chapter 12 and verse 1, and it says, "Wherefore," It's saying, hey, remember those people? Wherefore, because of those people, seeing we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, this is the first principle we have to get a hold of if we're going to move forward in a good way in the new year. Here it is. There is a crowd, a group of people, men and women, who have gone before us and done the hard work and endured the difficulty and the trial and trusted God by faith and seen God work in their lives. The problem is when difficulties and trial come into our lives, we think we're the only ones who have ever dealt with this before. No one else has had to deal with this before, only us. We're the first ones. We kind of place ourselves in the center of the universe. And if things are going well for us, then the world is going well. And if it's not, then the world is not going so well. Before we even set out to do something great, before we take that next step of faith, we have to remember we're not the first ones who have been down this path. Others have gone before us, and they've done a great job. And in a way that we can only imagine, figuratively, if you will, they're cheering us on. Wherefore, seeing we are compassed or surrounded with this cloud of witnesses, this crowd that's gone before us, they're surrounding us. The first principle or perspective we need to get hold of is this: there is a crowd of people that have done this work before us. We're not alone. We're the next in a stream of legacy that goes beyond generations. People who have done the hard things, made the hard decisions, and moved forward by faith. You are not alone. There's a crowd, but we see number two, the second principle or perspective, there is a cause. Seeing we are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us. We'll come back to that in a minute. And let us run with patience the race set before us. So often when the difficulties, the trials, the tribulations, the traumas of life come into our lives, we stop moving forward because we lose hope. What is hope? I've described hope as being that which is outside of the circle we stand in. Hope is understanding that where we are is not all there is, that there is a God who's outside of space and time, who's bigger than all of it. We could say it this way, though: there is purpose. Hope is purpose. Hope is meaning. Hope is value. For what we're talking about today, hope is the cause. We are to run with patience. We're all running, whether we like to admit it or not. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. That's what life is about. From when we're born to when we die, we're on this path, engaged in this race of life. But I love the wording there. Run with patience the race set before us. God has set the race before you. God has set the cause or the purpose before you. What God has called you to do is different than what God has called me to do. What God has called you to do reflects your unique personality and situation and circumstance, and even your past, the good and the bad. God has a plan for your life, that cause, that race He set before us, that is unique to you and can only be fulfilled by you. That is the cause. And if we're going to keep moving forward when life becomes difficult, marching when it would be easier to stay where we are and die, we have to accept and put our hands around this cause that God has called us to. There is a crowd, those who've gone before us. There is a cause, the reason we move forward, utilizing our gifts, talents, and opportunities for the glory of God. There's a third C, and that is the cost. I think so many people fail to run the race with patience and fail to move forward, to march when it would be easier to stay where they are and die, because they're not willing to pay the price. You know, there's a cost for anything important. There's always a price. And the author here explains to us, after telling us there's a crowd and getting ready to tell us there's a cause, right in the middle, he says there's a cost. What is the cost? He says laying aside every weight and the sin which besets us. The order here is really important, and I love it. He doesn't start with sin. He starts with weights. He says there's weight and sin which besets us. That word besets, it means it ties us down. It's like it wraps us up. It keeps us from fully being what we are supposed to be, from moving as fast as we can move and accomplishing all that we can accomplish. It has us wrapped up or chained up. Well, the first thing he mentions are those weights. And this is very interesting because this is not morally good or bad. It's not right or wrong. It's not sinful or not sinful. It's just weight. These may be hobbies. These may be other things that we're engaged in that are preventing us from running the race that God has called us to run. What are you engaged in that has you bound up in a way that keeps you from being fully free to do what God wants you to do? We need to take an inventory of our lives and ask that question. What am I doing? What hobbies do I have? What things am I involved in? What am I spending my time on that is taking away from my ability to do what God has called me to do? That's the weight. Again, it's not sin. It's not good or bad, and that's what makes this dangerous. It's easy for us to say, well, this isn't bad. This isn't evil. This isn't sinful. The Bible doesn't talk bad about this or talk against this, but if it's something preventing you from moving forward for God's glory, then it needs to be eliminated from our lives. That's the cost. He then also talks about sin, not just weight, but sin. And sin is something that is much clearer to us. It's easier for us to understand. This does have a moral component. It's wrong. It is against God. It violates His principles in our lives. Sin is easier for us to understand, but some people are so wrapped up in sin that they're unwilling to cut that out of their lives so they can do what God has called them to do. Some people are so wrapped up in habitual sin, that is a sin that comes with a habit or an addiction, that instead of putting the time and the effort and the energy and the humility into dealing with that or addressing that, they throw up their hands and say, this is just who I am. And again, they lose hope. They forget the cause or acknowledge the cause, but because they're unwilling to pay the price, they never fully become and accomplish what God has set before them. There is a crowd, those who've gone before us. There is a cause, what God has called us to. There is a cost, the things that need to be cut out. But there is also, and we're so thankful for this, Jesus Christ. That's the last C. Looking unto Jesus, verse number 2 says. See, it's easy for us to know there are people who have done this and know that there's something we should do and understand there's a cost. And understanding all of that, still become overwhelmed by life. All of us have been there. And so the author, after laying all of that down, acknowledges, and I know you can't do this on your own, so here's how you need to do it, by following Jesus. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, the Bible says, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. Jesus is our example. He left heaven, he came to earth, fully God and fully man. He died in our place on the cross, murdered by his creation. Think about that. Was placed in a tomb. Because he's God, he rose again from the dead of his own power 3 days later, defeating sin and defeating death. He is our example. We pursue Jesus. The only way to accomplish the cause, to do what God has called you to do, is by pursuing or following Jesus, learning more of him, spending time in his word and spending time in prayer and spending time around other believers and being fully committed to doing what he's called us to do. Again, that last verse, verse number 3, says, lest you be wearied and faint in your minds. There will be times when we become exhausted, overwhelmed, burdened with the difficulty of it all. And the author is saying, lest ye be, right? In case this happens, or we could say, when this happens, go back to the beginning. And remember, there's a crowd, those who've gone before you. There's a cause, what God has called you to. There's a cost, some things you need to cut out, but there is a Savior, Jesus Christ, who sets the example and is the one that we need to follow as we run this race, walk this path, engage in this cause that God has set before us. I hope that is a help to you as you get into whatever you're going to get into this year. And again, this is helpful at any time of the year, not just at the beginning of the year. But at the beginning of the year, it's very helpful. And I hope that you will take those 4 principles or perspectives and really get a hold of them and engage with them and let God fully do in your life what he wants to do this year. Next week, we'll talk about some other perspectives, some other thoughts as we get into the new year, trying to lay the foundation and the groundwork. And then we're going to get into some great guests and a lot of other exciting things for the podcast going forward this year. Excited about it and really appreciate you joining this conversation. Again, if you have not yet subscribed, do that. Subscribe from wherever you're listening from, and that would be fantastic. And check out, I always push people over here, check out lifeaudio.com. Some great podcasts there as well. Great daily devotionals and other things there as you're getting started in your year. And I mentioned them because they host this podcast, and I'm very thankful for our partnership with them. So again, thank you for joining. Look forward to talking to you next time.